Okay, so on what the church, how the church teaches the world, how God teaches the world through His church. You have the Magisterium. So he first reveals Himself to the prophets and the apostles, and they write down parts of that oral tradition, of that inspiration. So there's an implicit oral tradition, or there's an implicit unwritten tradition before that it's all written down. So you have revelation in two forms. But anyway, there is components of the unwritten tradition, but those are used as a lens to interpret the scriptures early on. But at this point, almost everything that would have been part of the oral tradition has been committed to the church's, through the church's magisterium, has been committed to writing in some form. So then you'll have the consensus of the fathers and the ecumenical councils, and then you'll have the Pope. But the idea is that not every father is going to be completely accurate. So it's the consensus of the fathers, and even Orthodox will say this because they're going to say something like Pope Agatho or other early people that proposed the doctrine of the papal doctrines. Even Alexander Schmemann admits that it's at an ecumenical council. They say this, and that it's just that this error started creeping in really early. But they don't expect everybody in the Orthodox Church to be, perfect, especially early on, perfect in doctrine. But they know what the true doctrine is now, that the papal doctrine is false. Therefore, they can look back and they can say who in the tradition had it right and who had it wrong. Because what they have today is their anti-papal doctrine that they possess today is a lens that helps them interpret who was right and who was wrong early on, which is to put the cart before the horse, especially in the traditional Christian epistemology, because you're supposed to say that as Adrian Fortescue says in his chapter in the early papacy, he says that to not find the doctrine that we're looking for in an early source doesn't mean anything, because we don't think the church is bound to being only understanding a doctrine early or expressing it explicitly early on, because it's the same church early on and later. The later church helps us interpret the earlier church, but that's not the same thing as saying that if we find evidence contrary, we find that the early church did not teach the Catholic doctrines, then that would be a defeater for the Catholic position. So basically, absence of evidence is not a defeater for Catholic Church, but absence of contradiction in the early church, that is a defeater. So it should be a defeater to. This is a traditional principle. The consensus of the early church, if we find a doctrine early on, that's more likely to be true than the later consensus, if the later consensus contradicts it. So when Alexander Schmemann says I heard this first with J. Dyer, and he basically said, we don't expect everybody to be true. So if we hear some papal doctrine from the mouth of St. John Chrysostom or Pope Agatho or an ecumenical or whoever, we don't expect them to all be perfect. Likewise, Alexander Schmemann admits that the ecumenical councils taught the papal doctrine, but that's just because this error was early on. Well, they're presupposing the error, and then they're judging they're judging the fathers. Whereas we should allow the fathers to teach us, and then the perennial teaching is consistent, and we see the consistent teaching throughout history, especially see it early on, and that is evidence, because it's not that there is no evidence of the papal doctrine. There is evidence from the early church. I guess the claim is that there's mixed evidence, and that the later truth of that orthodoxy has come to, the later Orthodox consensus against the papal doctrines, is the tiebreaker against that mixed evidence early on. So, but the epistemological question is that you have, inference to the best explanation is essentially, does the magisterium use it? We have the church, we have the magisterium, we have the individual bishops, we have individual theologians, and the individual theologians, the bishops in communion with the Pope, they have the charisma of the teaching office and the protection of the Holy Spirit to guarantee that the church will never bind the conscience of the faithful to an error or a heresy. And so there's a supernatural guidance, and that's not offered to theologians. And there's a lot of nuances there, but epistemologically, you have all the evidence, the data of revelation, of the deposit of faith, and then some doctrines are just the inference to the best explanation that it best explains all the data from revelation. If you add this extra doctrine that clarifies something, that's be a secondary object of infallibility or whatever. And so, and theologians do this too when they're looking at the entire body of both Revelation and Magisterium.